welcome. My name is Walter Liu. I'm the CEO and founder of Corona Labs. We have a product called Corona SDK, which allows you to create apps 10 times more quickly, so you can create all sorts of interactive content, whether it's games, ebooks, or even business apps. If you want to do hybrid applications, you want to mix web views with OpenGL, Corona makes it really incredibly easy. And when a lot of people say cross-platform, we actually set a pretty high bar when we say cross-platform. We actually mean 90-95%, not 60% cross-platform. So for this talk, I'm not really going to talk about Corona SDK per se. I'm going to talk about how you are an app developer who want to tackle fragmentation, and we're going to use Corona as sort of a case study and kind of dive into some of the issues, not all of them, but some of the issues that we've dealt with to kind of make your life easier in Corona, and so hopefully you can bring that home to your app or decide that maybe you want to try out Corona. So before I go on, I think it's worth talking about how software development used to be. So, I started my career at Adobe a long time ago on Illustrator, and back in that day, there were two platforms you developed software for. There was Windows and there was Macintosh. And back in those days, distribution of software was in a box. You went to a retail store and you bought a box of software, and either it was floppy disks or CD-ROMs. Now it's DVDs and now it's online. But back in that day, you installed off a CD-ROM of some sort. And so there are all sorts of things that you would buy just off the shelf. I think the biggest change that's happened, obviously, in this post-PC era is that there's just a multiplicity of devices now. It's no longer just Mac and Windows. Today, of course, there's iOS and Android, but with Android, there's just, Android itself is like almost a multiple set of operating systems in itself just because there's so many differences. And we'll talk about how we deal with that and how you might want to think about that. And so today, when you distribute software, it's no longer shrink wrap. It's no longer CD-ROM. You buy it like you buy an MP3 off of iTunes, or an AAC file, audio file, or music off iTunes, or a similar kind of store. So when we think about development, I think the pipeline kind of follows three different pieces. First, there's design, where you're designing and coming out with the look of the app, the workflow, the images, the audio files, the video files. Then the actual development, you're actually doing the coding. And then there's the distribution. How do you get your app noticed? What kind of services and monetization do you want to worry about? So there are a lot of pieces that come into play when you're actually trying to do real app development today. So I'm just going to go briefly into design. That's not really going to be the focus of this talk, but even at the design stage, there are some things that you need to think about. So one of them obviously is there's tons of different screen sizes and shapes. They come in all forms, and you really have to think about how do you want to deal with those screen sizes. Do you want things to scale up? Do you want to relay things out? And so there's a lot of problems like that at the design level that you have to worry about. The other thing that you have to worry about is retina imaging. So, can everyone hear me? Okay. So, retina imaging is the idea that there are different pixel densities, and you don't want your images to look pixelated. One of the things, if you're writing a game, that you want to keep in mind is that if you're doing a sprite sheet, you want to have a sprite sheet in multiple resolutions. So if you want for iPhone 4 versus the original iPhone, for example. In terms of media formats, there are a couple things you have to worry about, and if you only want to worry about single platform, you have more flexibility. But as soon as you want to go to both iOS and Android, you have to worry about, okay, are the file formats supported on both platforms? Because ideally, you'd like to just have one audio format, set of audio files that work on all platforms. In our experience with Corona, we found that MP3 works well on both for kind of longer kind of music. And for event sounds, Wave seems to be the lowest common denominator across both iOS and Android. If you're dealing with just individual platforms, obviously you can kind of go and pick and choose. You can do AEC on iOS, it's not supported on Android. And on Android you can do OGG, for example. For video, M4V is the lowest common denominator. There's a little bit of confusion on the web. A lot of people say M4V is not supported on Android, but I think when they say that, it's really the DRM aspects that are not supported. If you have a non-DRM M4V file, it actually works. We've actually tried it ourselves. It's a sample code in Corona. So just be aware that there are these DRM issues that you may have to worry about, and whether that'll actually support for individual format. Okay, so the meat of this talk is actually going to be about the development and coding. So it's worth kind of drawing a distinction between what it used to be back 10 years ago and what it is today. So back in the day when there's really only two platforms, where Linux is, if you believe Linux was a viable desktop platform, there were really only a handful of platforms, and there were only kind of two instruction sets to worry about. There was PowerPC and Intel, now it's just all Intel. And I guess it was a lot easier back then, because you just had two operating systems. It was a lot easier. Among the Windows platforms, the desktops are pretty consistent. There were some issues, but largely it was pretty easy to manage. I think today, it's just become a lot less manageable. If you think about all the kinds of devices that are out there, there's all sorts of hardware. You have to worry about what version of ARM instruction sets are supported. There are a lot more platforms. The most popular are iOS and Android, but obviously there's Windows, there's BlackBerry, which just released a new device. And on top of that, you have services. So you have to worry about, well, what service do I want to use? How do I monetize in each individual platform? There's different in-app purchase solutions. The game networks are different, and all sorts of things like that really make this a really challenging landscape. So, as I mentioned earlier, we're going to use Corona as kind of a case study and say, well, what did we do in Corona that made this problem a little more tractable? And before I go on, I guess I should tell you what Corona is, for those of you who don't know. Corona is just an SDK for native applications. We packaged up all these great technologies, and it allows you to really develop 5 to 10 times faster, because we've really vastly simplified the problem for you. We've really ironed out all the issues. And the goal is to really be cross-platform. 95% of your code will be the same across all your platforms. So I thought it'd be useful to kind of talk to you about the Corona architecture, and then talk about how you might architect your own app so that it can be cross-platform. So in a Corona world, we have basically an abstraction layer on top of the operating system, and that's what we see kind of there with the Corona app. And then you develop on top of that. So you have your native assets, your code. And basically, if you want to create your own app, you would just take this architecture, and it would look something like this. Your native mobile app would be some sort of core engine. There'd be some sort of abstraction layer on top of, platform system implementations of iOS, Android, etc., etc. And when you do that, you need to worry about several things. So first of all, you want to standardize your types. So you want to make sure that a 1 byte type is 1 byte type, a 32-bit type, 32-bit type. And so you should use standard header like standard int.h. There's no need to really invent your own. The other thing that we want to worry about is the fact that there are multiple operating system versions out there. And this is actually a pretty significant problem. It's a kind of a decision you have to kind of make up front. Am I going to support just the latest version of the operating system? Or am I going to support something that goes all the way back to version 4.x on iOS? And on Android, it's even more difficult because 4.x is pretty feature powerful, and it solves a lot of issues like some of the audio latency issues. But unfortunately, there are still a significant number of 2.3 devices out there, and there are a significant number of 2.2 devices out there. And so it's a little bit of a decision on your part about what you want to support. So just so you know, for Corona, we support all the way back to 4.3, and for Android, we support all the way back to 2.2. And so there are various ways in your code in which you have to manage that so that certain APIs are supported or not supported across different Android versions. They even change the name sometimes across versions, and I'll show you a little bit about how you deal with that. So on iOS, if you want to support iOS 6 and iOS 5, so for example, there is this new social kit framework which allows you to add Facebook UI, even Weibo and Twitter. It has great kind of nice features around supporting those features, but it's only available on iOS 6. So if you want to make your app work on iOS 5, you have to do several things to make your projects work. One of them is that you have to weak link against the framework. So if you're saying, I want to include the social functionality of iOS, you have to do an Xcode say, hey, I want to make this an optional link, and that will tell the operating system, hey, even on iOS 5, even if you can't find it, it'll still launch. If you don't do that, you'll actually get a crash at launch time, and your customers will complain, or probably Apple won't even approve your app. Now, if you do that, you have to have some code that kind of distinguishes whether or not this thing is available or not. And so that's the line at the bottom. It basically just says, if you use an API, just call the class method, and if it returns nil, you know it's not available. And it returns something that's not nil, then you know it is. And so you can basically switch off of that to determine whether or not you should make that feature available in your application. On Android, we're giving an example of how you would use an Android. So in Java, there is this constant called android.os.build.version_SDK_int. And all that really does let you basically decide how you want to switch off your functionality. And so it's not quite as clean, but the way we do it is we basically create different classes that implement the same method. We just call the different version depending on what version we're in. So in this case, for push notification, it turns out that the APIs changed a lot between versions. They moved some and they added some. So there was some changes between 2.x, 3.x, and 4.x, and we had to do a lot of massaging to make that all work. And so we had something that looked somewhat like this. Basically, you just switch off a version and you call a different method depending on what version it is. And under the hood, in each of the create notification methods, there's a reflection that determines whether or not the whole thing's available or not. So it's a little bit more manual. It's not quite as clean as it is in iOS, but you can get it done. So I guess people like to hear about war stories. So I'm going to tell you about 2 different war stories about how to make OpenGL work on Android. It turns out that not all devices are created equal when it comes to OpenGL. So we encountered a very, very weird bug on certain set of devices that use the PowerVR SGX 540, which is a little getting technical, but basically what it boils down to is on the left-hand side is what looks correct, and on the right-hand side is what looks incorrect. So on the left-hand side you expect some sort of image to blend with a blue background, and on the right-hand side when it blends, you start to see these black kind of, it's almost like it's blending against black and then against the blue background. You're like, what happened? And we had a lot of customers complain, even some big publishers were creating ebooks saying, hey, why does this thing look weird on these devices? And we were like, we don't know, that looks really weird. And it turns out it was some sort of weird setting that we had to work around, or some device driver bug. We found a workaround where we keyed off the actual graphics card, but it was pretty painful. And so this is a story that we hear a lot when people develop on Android, not just from Corona developers, but normal just Android native app developers, that they hit this all the time. I remember there was some sort of pre-session thing for Google I/O last summer where they had this game summit, and I think one major publisher decided, you know what, we're going to blacklist 500 devices because we just can't support them all. There's too many to test. And so they just chose the most popular device and said, we're only supporting these. So that's one solution around the problem. The other solution is just you have a developer community like ours that reports these problems, and then we kind of figure out a solution. On HTC devices, we actually saw another bug. This one is on a particular kind of graphics chip where, how many of you know OpenGL? At all? Okay, so 2. So for those of you who don't know, basically there's this one function called GL gem textures, and each time you call it, we expect a different number to be returned. And in this case, it returned the same number, which was very, very strange, and that caused a bunch of rendering bugs and things didn't appear correctly, and especially when you suspend and resume. So there are all these kinds of problems that you have to worry about on Android, unfortunately, because the OpenGL implementations are beholden to who makes the graphics chip and then who writes the device driver. And it gets a little low level. I guess if I'm to make an analogy, it's kind of like the whole DLL hell thing you might have remembered from the Windows days. So that's kind of what you have to deal with. It's unfortunate because I think there's a lot of opportunity on Android. It's just that when you deal with this, it really slows you down when you want to get to market quickly with your application. But it's good to be aware of. So hopefully now you will be able to integrate that into your own code. So I'm not going to talk about all the development war stories, but I just want to give you a glimpse of the kinds of problems that you have to encounter when you're dealing with just iOS and Android, and then just even within Android itself. There's just a lot of problems that you have to kind of worry about. So I guess I'm going to just make a shameless plug that instead of remembering everything I talked about today, you can just use Corona. We solved this problem for you. And you can do it 10 times faster. So you can just go to coronalabs.com and download it. There you go. Also, by the way, we have a contest right now. So if you retweet one of our Apps World tweets at Corona Labs, you are entered into a contest to win a free tablet device. So please retweet us. If you have any other questions about cross-platform development and or Corona, we have a booth back there for Corona Labs, and feel free to stop by. So with that, open up for a Q&A. Thank you.
Hey, One is, how do you interact with the GPL? And second one is, do you have any war stories concerning the switch around API 9 to 10 on Android involving the garbage collection?
So how do we deal, the first question was, how do we deal with, I already forgot.
GPL.
GPL. So with iOS, you cannot do anything with GPL just because everything's statically linked. And in GPL rules, if you statically link something in, you have to then open source your own code. So if you're okay with open sourcing your own code, then I guess it's fine. But if not, then you probably should stay away. On Android, you're allowed to have, that's a little bit hairy, I don't know. On Android, it's still not clear.
So yeah.
Yeah, on Android, I think you can link against LGPL, but I'm not an expert, so consult with your favorite IP intellectual expert on that one. In terms of war story around garbage collection, I seem to recall they changed the amount of memory that was allocated, and so we suddenly saw a lot of people complain about out-of-memory errors. But I think you can override that in your Android manifest.
They said that it was that the garbage collection got a lot more vicious. Right. Right around that.
Right. We hit another.
So they said the garbage collection got a lot more vicious.
Yeah.
I think we hit another war story where they, by default, decompressed images in a 16-bit and switched to 32-bit, and without really telling anyone. So I think that caused a lot of people on Stack Overflow to complain a lot, including us. But.
Okay, any other questions? Yes, we have one here. My friend right from behind you.
Hi, today's the first time I ever heard the term fragmentation.
Okay.
Where did it come from and what does it mean exactly?
Okay, so I probably should have defined that up front.
Where have you been? Fragmentation has been a nightmare for the last...
iOS.
Well, even on iOS there's fragmentation, right? I showed you that if you're going between platforms, you need to worry about what version you want to support, what features are available. So fragmentation gets magnified if you start to step outside of iOS, move into Android, because not only do you have to support one platform, but then you have to support another platform. There's fragmentation in terms of versioning, and then even within Android itself, not all devices are consistent. So Apple owns the whole stack, and so they can guarantee consistent hardware. But in Android, you have all sorts of hardware vendors putting all sorts of things from all over the place. And so you don't really know how well things are. So for example, I remember a guy in NVIDIA was complaining, yeah, we have two NVIDIA chips on two different Android devices, and it's fast on one and slow on the other. And he told me the reason was some subtle reason around how fast the memory they put on the device affected the performance of the graphics card itself. So there are all these subtle issues that are really, really difficult, and so fragmentation is really the kind of umbrella term for all of that.
It's the biggest nightmare most of us have. Any other questions?
I won't. Just a very simple one. You're saying Corona gets to a point where you've got 95% of your code the same.
Right.
On Android, you're on Java. The iOS Objective-C, what's the deal?
Well, so our core engine is C, C++, and so we do is the platform-specific implementation on iOS is Objective-C, and on Java we cross the JNI bridge for anything that relies on like web views. If we want to throw up a web view, we have to go into the Java side, so we can cross the JNI bridge to do that. If we want to access the network, right, we just go through the JNI call. But for the OpenGL side, we stay on the C++ side, so it's a hybrid on Java, or on Android, sorry, where it's partly Java and partly C++.
Anything else? No, in which case I think we'll say thank you very much for that.
Yeah, so if you have any more questions or want to talk in front of crowd, we'll be back at the booth back there, so feel free to stop by.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.